Amazing. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Good to see you, or at least your names. I'm hoping you had a wonderful week, a healthy week, a week of brought on Simcha. And again, as we've said before, may the merit of our learning Torah together be a merit for all those who need a refuah, all those who need a Yeshua, for the return of the body of Ron Vili, so his family can give him the proper covenant that a Meit Yisrael needs. And also, I just want to mention, hopefully, that Hashem should watch over one of my oldest friends who I used to go to kindergarten while we were in public school with Elkwood and St. Clair, um, Yechiel Chaim Ben Adela. May Hashem watch over him. So I'm a little bit reluctant about these parshiot, but I think it has to be said that the parashat that we're studying now in the beginning of Sefer Shemot essentially comprise, as you know, the Pesach story. Yes, I said it. I said the P word, Pesach. So I know it's a little bit early to think about Pesach, but the truth of the matter is we have no choice. This is the story of Pesach as it's told in the beginning. The Haggadah does it in a different way, and I want to touch a little bit on that a little bit later, but we're there. Oh, and by the way, I've mentioned this to others privately, but those you may or may not be aware of a fascinating, since we're talking about Pesach, I have to mention this. There's a very fascinating initiative that has been undertaken by some community-minded members in our community, maybe elsewhere, I believe, and that is the acquisition of shmur matzah for only $29 a pound. $29 a pound. And this is shmur matzah that is actually being grown in the Ukraine. And there is some sort of advertising flyer that's been circulating because it does require pre-ordering. And for those who are looking for handmade kosher shmur matzah, as some of you may know, this is an extremely, extremely amazing offer because it usually is in the $60 per pound range, unless you buy the box ones, you maybe get it at Sobeys, coming from Israel. But for those who are looking for some options, this may be an amazing option if you're inclined to take advantage of it. We can talk about details later, or you can message me afterwards. In any event, I thought I'd mention that as a public service announcement. I get no commission. I don't get a cut in this, but I just thought I would let everybody know. So let's begin with a little bit of an overview of the Parsha, which actually is not going to be so complicated because it's the Pesach story. So the Parsha begins with Hashem turning to Moshe following the end of last week's Parsha, where Moshe expresses his disappointment, his confusion, his upset with Hashem. He had hoped that God would, in fact, bring about the redemption quickly. It doesn't seem to be unfolding quickly. In fact, not only is it not happening quickly, but after Moshe and Aaron present themselves to Paro, as you remember, things get worse for the Jewish people. Lama hareota la'am hazeh, asked Moshe. Why did you make things worse? I don't understand. And so following that, we begin with Parsha Vaera. So Hashem reveals himself to Moshe. And one of the famous parts of the introduction is Hashem promises Geula redemption. And he promises it through the use of four, actually five, separate verbs to describe the redemptive process. In Hebrew, v'hotzeti, v'hitzalti, v'ga'alti, v'lakachti, that's four. Hotzeti, I shall take them out. Hitzalti, I shall save them. Ga'alti, I shall redeem them. Lakachti, I shall take them to me. And the last, the fifth one is Veheveti otam, and I shall bring them to the land of Israel. Get back to that in 1 second. And Hashem telling Moshe that he's going to bring the Jewish people, of course, to his chosen mountain and reveal himself to the Jewish people on the mountain. So the rest of the parsha is Moshe and Aharon following through with Hashem's instructions, going and presenting themselves over and over again to Paro. And what we see here, of course, is the beginning of that section of the 10 plagues, the Esser Makot, one after the other. And as some of the Meforshim point out, if you read the section carefully, as I'm sure you do, you'll notice that some Makot come with a pre-warning to Paro, and some Makot come without any warning to Paro. And what's the reason behind that? That's also subject for discussion. And as we later know through our Pesach Haggadah, there's the P word again, that these Aser Makot, they don't all finish in this Parsha. They do finish in next week's Parsha. They're also clumped together by Rabbi Yehuda Omer, and the Tzach Adash Be'achav. The 10 Makot are given their first letter, and they create these three groupings of the Makot. We'll try to talk a little bit about that. If not this week, then Yetz Hashem next week. So some of the Makot, of course, we know the water turns to blood, frogs are overrun, lice infests everybody, there's hordes of wild animals, there's pestilence that kills animals, painful boils afflict the Egyptians. The seventh plague is fire and ice, barad, that comes from the skies. It's devastating hail. But still, as the Torah tells us, the heart of Paro hardens and he will not let the Jewish people go. So that's the overview. Let's just back up a second and just a couple of comments about the idea of these makot. So the makot in English are called plagues. Well, what's the purpose of the plagues? And there's a lot to say about that. I'm not going to speak too much. I just want a couple of ideas. So I think when you read the stories, the first inclination or the first response that maybe would come to mind is these are punishments for the savage treatment of the Jewish people. Now we know from the time of Abraham, God foretold to Abraham, he foretold to Abraham that the Jewish people would be strangers in a strange land, but would be enslaved. Okay. And in fact, later on in Tanakh, this experience is called Kur Barzel, which is the fiery furnace that purifies metal and drains out all the impurities to strengthen the metal. In other words, in the words of Nevi'im later, in retrospect, talking about why this period of Jewish history is so critical, because it was a nation-building experience. And so we understand that what God was doing by bringing Yaakov and his family and later all the generations and enslaving them, it was a way to, as it were, prepare the Jewish people for our role throughout all of history. This was in some ways, an incubator period for the Jewish people. But having said that, meaning having said that the experience that we had in Egypt was necessary for our national growth and creating some sort of collective DNA pool that strengthens and gives us the wherewithal to withstand all of the things that history throws at us. So why was it necessary to, as it were, punish, if the Makot were punish the Egyptian nation? If this was part of the plan, then it's unfair to punish Egyptians for being part of a divine plan, after all. And so the answer that's often given is it was a divine plan, but the Egyptians exceeded what was necessary for them to do. That there are slaves in the ancient world, that's clear. But the way in which the Egyptians treated their slaves called Bnei Israel exceeded what was necessary. Yes, there was a divine plan, but the Egyptians exceeded what was necessary for that initial experience for the Jewish people, and was for that cruelty, it was for the savagery, and it was for the refusal to sort of listen that they ultimately bear responsibility. And if you take a look very carefully, if you read through this parasha, and you take a look at some of the language used when Hashem introduces the various plagues of the ones he does, remember there's a three grouping, three, and then four, three, and four at the end with Makat Bechorah being the 10th plague. You'll notice that it's really never, the Torah never really uses the word onish, but what it does say is that the Egyptian people will come to know God, that the Makot were always seen essentially as a tool for educating the Egyptian people, meaning that what this could have been, what it could have been, is an opportunity for the Egyptian people to realize things about the existence of God in the universe. And if you take a look at some of the classical Meforshim who explain and try to offer some insights into the overall experience, one of the things, a theme that you see from amongst many of them, is that one of the things that God was hoping to prove was his not only existence, but God's providence, not only over the Jewish people, but over the entire world. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we get closer to the end of this parsha. But the makot, again, essentially, were not in their origin intended to be punitive only. There is probably a punitive element, but they were essentially, I think, in the core, understood as an opportunity for growth and for understanding God's role in the world. Now, we talked a little bit, I mentioned that at the very beginning, God describes the redemptive process by using 5 verbs. I think most of us are familiar with the idea of the 4 terms of Geulah redemption. That's mentioned explicitly in the Talmud Yerushalmi. Mentioned the four expressions again. V'hotzeti, v'hitzalti, v'ga'alti, v'lakachti. I shall take out the Jewish people. I shall save the Jewish people. I shall redeem the Jewish people, and I shall take them to me. I shall be their God. They shall be my nation. The Talmud Yerushalmi says those 4 terms of redemption become the source for something we all know and we all do at the Seder table. We drink 4 cups of wine. The 4 cups of wine are, as we're paralleling the 4 languages of redemption. But just pause for 1 second. And it's not, I think this is maybe something all of us intuited. Why is there 4 languages, or actually 5? If 18, I shall bring the Jewish people into the land of Israel. Why? Why not 1 word? Why not say, boom, I am going to redeem the Jewish people, and then do it, finished. V'ga'alti et b'nei Israel. Why do we need 4? And I think there are many answers, but one of the answers that probably really reflects the nature of Jewish history and also reflects another statement that the Gemara makes is the nature of Geula. The nature of redemption is kima kima, which means little bit by little bit. There is no one big bang theory of redemption. That's not the way it works. That's not the way Hashem ever intended it to be. The process by which Hashem manifests the redemption of the Jewish people in Egypt is in a process. And it's not immediate, it's in a process. And as we know, the way in which our tradition, our rabbis, the Gemara treats and responds to these stories in Sefer Shemot is it sees them as paradigmatic. The redemptive process in Egypt is somehow seen to contain seeds of the redemption of the Jewish people throughout the ages. So we look to the story of Pesach not just as a way of knowing how we're going to observe and celebrate Pesach every year on the 15th day of Nisan. It's true, some of the stories and some of the instructions in these parashot tell us, inform the basis of the halachot that we observe. That's true. But more on a bigger level, on a conceptually framework level, this experience of redemption in some ways becomes a model of redemption for the Jewish people. And one aspect of that model is just that. It's never a one-shot deal. It's kima kima. It's a redemptive process that takes time. And that's not always what we want. And that may be one of the reasons that we're going to get into the first of our Torah, that the Parsha begins with Hashem responding to Moshe Rabbeinu's comment. So Moshe Rabbeinu comes and, quote unquote, in good faith, he does exactly what Hashem tells him to do. He tries to gather all the elders. He goes with Aharon. He stands in front of Paro. He says the famous words, Shlach et ami v'avduni, let my people go so they can serve me. Excuse me. And Paro scoffs. And of course, he increases the workload and everybody gets upset and nobody wants to listen. And they're angry with Paro, angry with Moshe. And Moshe then turns to God and says, what's going on here? So this week's Parsha begins, and again, if you want to use a Chumash, you're certainly welcome to. So I'm going to start with chapter 6, Perek Vav, Pasuk Gimel. And Sefer Shemot. I'm going to just open up my Chumash. Okay. Pasuk Gimel. Vaera el Avraham el Yitzchak el Yaakov b'keil Shakai u'shmi Hashem lo nodati lahem. The English translation interpretation. I appeared to Avram, to Yitzchak, and to Yaakov as, and here are the 2 names of the 7 names of Hashem, Keil and Shakai, but with my name Hashem, Yud, K, Vav, K, the 4 letters, Yud, the K, the Vav, and the K, which we pronounce as Hashem, I did not make myself known to them. So one of the things that Hashem tells Moshe is, I want you to understand something, that there's a difference between you, Moshe, and all the Avot, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So Hashem says one of the differences is the way in which Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov came to understand God in the world, and the way you, Moshe, came to understand God in the world. Rav Dov Weinberger was the rabbi of the Young Israel in Brooklyn, in the Williamsburg section. And I've quoted him before. I love his Divrei Torah. He wrote a commentary to not every pasuk. He wrote his ideas in some of the pasukim throughout Chumash called Shemin Hatov. And in his first chelik, his first volume, he makes the following observation. And he says, what God was trying to tell Moshe at this pasuk is that Moshe is different. You see, earlier on in the world, earlier on in the period of time of our Avot, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, they did come to understand God. They were introduced to God. But the way in which God chose deliberately, intentionally, to reveal himself in the world was through the natural world order. And so, there are two levels, says Rabbi Weinberger, to God's revelation in the world. In Revelation, I'm not talking about that moment at Har Sinai. I'm talking about his general revelation. The first one, says Rabbi Weinberger, is through nature. That everything that transpires, that all sort of God's presence in the world is woven through the natural universe that God created and adheres to more or less the natural order. Meaning, it's not through spectacular miracles. So if you think about the stories of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and think about what happened to them, you'll probably remember that there's nothing that is overtly suspension of the natural order. So, for example, the story where Avram liberates Lot. Okay, so the story tells us that so few people went with Abraham. He gathered 319 men to engage in a battle against multiple armies. So it was a miracle? Of course it was a miracle. But it transpired through military conflict. Military conflict happens. It happens in the ancient world, and as we well know, it happens in the modern world. So Avram engaged in battle. Was he a great strategist? Maybe. Was he an unbelievable warrior? Possibly. But it was a miracle. But it was a miracle that transpired through the natural order of the world. And so too with Yitzhak, and so too with Yaakov. There are things that happen to them that you could say are evidence of God's divine providence and God's watchful eye, and even miracles, but they happen in a manner that is in some ways hidden through the natural order of the universe. But then think about Moshe. Think about everything we know of Moshe from the time he's born till this moment in history. There's a lot of miracles that are going on here. Things that Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov never saw. So even within the story that we read recently, where God appears to Moshe Rabbeinu at the Sneh, the burning bush. Well, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov didn't really see a burning bush. And what about the signs that Hashem showed Moshe at the burning bush? The staff that turned into a snake. His hand became leprous. Water turns into blood. All of those things are miracles. All of those things are not the way in which God revealed himself to the world for Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. But to Moshe, he did. So Moshe's encounter with God is fundamentally, essentially different than the manner in which Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov came to understand God. As a result of that distinction, it now becomes more clear to us what was it that motivated Moshe's response in the previous Parsha, and how Hashem is trying to respond in this week's Parsha. So Moshe's experience of God was through all these extraordinary moments, extraordinary events, extraordinary things that happened. And they happened right there in front of his eyes. And his arm changed in front of his eyes. And the stick changed in front of his eyes. And here he was when he met Paro the first time, and the stick changed into a snake in front of everybody's eyes. And so when you live through that, and when you encounter God through that, what is your expectation? Your expectation is, in front of my eyes, it's all going to change in front of my eyes, just like it did when God revealed himself to me. And that didn't happen. It didn't happen the way Moshe thought it might happen based on his encounters with God. And so what Rabbi Weinberger is telling us is that Moshe is confused perhaps, and then he says what he does, an outburst. It's an brazen outburst, last week's Parsha. And Hashem turns to him and says, Moshe, you need to understand that your experience of me, your encounter with me, your level of understanding the way in which I present in the world is very different than the way Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov understood. But it does sort of, I think, encourage us to also think about the way we encounter God in the universe, in the world, in our lives, clearly, but not only in our lives personally, but even the lives of the Jewish people. And which would be the way in which God is revealing himself to us? Is it more like Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? Or is it more like Moshe? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. And I've been thinking about that. There are things that happen, we would definitely say these are divine miracles. So, for example, during the Iran war, when Iran was sending over these ballistic missiles and they landed in Israel and they never really caused serious damage, miracle, 100%. Divine providence, I believe it is. But when you take a look at it, would you say, is that a Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov type miracle, or is that a Moshe type miracle? Is God making himself known to us through nature, in the natural order of things? It may mean that we still have to be appreciative of God's presence, or is it the spectacular miracles? Like, I think sometimes people say, if God revealed himself in the way in which he revealed himself to the Jewish people in the desert, and the way he revealed himself to Moshe, as is being described by Rabbi Weinberger in this supernatural way, this miraculous way that's evidently miraculous, clearly miraculous, then maybe we would be more of a believing nation. I'm not sure that's 100% true, by the way. I don't know whether miracles produce faith or not. My sense is they don't. Other people have spoken about that as well. And I've said this multiple times. If the supposition is that miracles create faith, that if you were to witness a miracle and you knew you were witnessing a miracle, it was clear to you that you were witnessing a miracle, then that would create a more faithful relationship between you, me, whoever we saw it, and God. That would be the premise. That would be the supposition. So if we had to go back in time and we had to identify a generation of Jews that we believed saw more miracles than any other generation, what generation would you pick? So we're not going to open up the mics here. I think it's fair to say the generation that we would identify or ought to be identified is the generation of Jews who left Egypt. Because as is described in the Torah and as is described through rabbinic explanation of all the 40 years that they were in the desert, there were miracles on a daily basis. There's the clouds, there's the fire, there's everything. There's all the time, every single day. And yet, it was that generation, especially as described not in the Parshas here, but in Sefer Bimidbar, that they probably were one of the most rebellious generations. So how does that work? How can you be a rebellious generation and yet see so many miracles? I think that's why miracles themselves don't necessarily create faith. But I just found it interesting to think about how we come to have our relationship to God and our expectation. Moshe had an expectation because of his encounter, the way in which God revealed himself. And God said to Moshe, the way I reveal to you may not be the way that I'm going to reveal myself to everybody else. So I don't know where we're at in the sort of which method God is speaking to us, but I just thought that distinction is worth thinking about. Okay, let's go on a little bit more, and we're going to remain a little bit in chapter 6. We're going to skip to, we'll go a little bit further. And I want to read, sorry. I'm going to read Psukim 10 to 12. Vayidaber Hashem Moshe limor, and Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, Bo daber al Paro melech Mitzrayim, v'yishalach et bnei Israel me'artzo. Come, speak to Paro, king of Egypt, that he send the children of Israel from his land. Vayidaber Moshe lifnei Hashem limor. Hein bnei Israel lo shamu elai, ve'ech yishma'eni Paro, v'ani aral sivatayim. And Moshe spoke before Hashem, saying, Behold, the children of Israel have not listened to me, so how will Paro listen to me? And I have sealed lips, meaning he had some sort of disability. He had a speech impediment. So just let's think about that for 1 second. So just taking the words as Moshe's intention from face value, Moshe seems to be creating a linkage here. He says, I went to the Jewish people and they didn't listen to me. So if they didn't listen to me, then for sure Paro's not going to listen to me. So Moshe thought that there's some sort of a linkage. If Jewish people didn't, then Paro for sure would not. But is that really true? Is his linkage correct? Now, although it's not mentioned here, it's mentioned last week's Parsha. Why did the Jewish people not listen to Moshe? So Moshe comes and he comes with this amazing message of redemption. Hey guys, God sent me, and get what? We're ready. He's going to be taking us out of Egypt. The Geula is coming. And they poo-pooed him, and they were upset with him for taking time away and raising their false hopes. But the reason that they didn't, the Torah says, was Kotzer Ruach. This was a people who were so enslaved, both physically, clearly, but also mentally and spiritually. Their spirits had been cut short. Their spirits had been malnourished for so long that even the thought, the promise of redemption really didn't mean anything. So that's why they didn't listen. They didn't respond. So just because they didn't respond doesn't necessarily mean Paro's not going to respond. What did one have to do with the other? So one possible answer may have to do with the end of the verse where Moshe says, Va'ani aral sifatayim. And I have some sort of impediment. My lips are sealed. I can't speak properly. I have impeded speech. So Moshe's claim was that he's not a public speaker. He's not good at oratory. He's not good at rhetoric. He's not good at speaking and convincing people. Some people do have a gift of talking, and some people are inspiring, and some people, when they talk, everybody wants to listen, and they got their eyes glued to it. And Moshe says, that's not me. That's not me. And both Bnei Israel and Paro needed to be convinced of something which ran in opposition, or which was really something that was not their natural instinct. The Jewish people's natural instinct of having been enslaved is not to respond quickly. And Paro, of course, as an authority, as a monarch, as a god, was not necessarily going to capitulate right away. So Bnei Israel needed to be assured that Moshe's initial attempt to secure their release would actually be fruitful, because so far it's been exactly the opposite. And Paro needed to be shown that he didn't have the right to enslave the Jewish people. Yeah, go tell a king you don't have the right to enslave a people. Well, that's what kings do. They're autocrat. They have absolute power. That's what the monarchy was in the ancient world. So Moshe's argument was just that, as his disability made it impossible for him to convince Bnei Israel, his disability stopped him from being a convincing leader, so too it would make it impossible for him to convince Paro. So, of course, that turned out not exactly to be the case, but it just does make us pause and think. And I just want to raise this idea with everybody. The process of change for the Jewish people, didn't occur because Moshe Rabbeinu was an amazing speaker. Not because he was uplifting and inspiring, and when he spoke, like everybody was taking notes. No. That ability can be valuable, and obviously it's an important asset. But maybe the point of this story, and the point of Moshe being Aral Sifatayim and Moshe not being a cogent speaker, is to remind us that may not be a critical factor, and may not be the determinant of a person's influence. It was specifically Moshe Rabbeinu, who was an Aral Sifatayim, a person with speech impediment, who led the process to change Pharaoh's heart. So oratory is useful, inspiration is useful, but it's not always indispensable. And I think it's important that we sometimes realize that our ability to grow and our ability to change and our willingness to improve is not because somebody dazzles us and not because somebody sort of speaks to us and inspires us, but it's got to come from within. And I often say, well, I love teaching, and I think I'm a pretty good speaker. I've been told that by the audience, and people say, "Oh, that was so inspiring," and I love that. I do. I think it's a compliment. But, and there's always a but I think the word inspiring has to be followed by the word to. You inspire someone to to what? There's got to be some action. The inspiration itself can only be that sort of impetus to do something, but you've got to do that something. And I think that's what's happening here, is that Hashem is trying to send a leader to the Jewish people who was not a perfect human being in any shape, manner, or form. He was the greatest prophet that we ever had and will have. And that's what one of the 13 principles of faith that we declare on a regular basis every day for those who recite the Yud Gimel Ikarei, whether you're reciting Gigdal or you're reciting Amin Ma'amin at the end of David, excuse me. Moshe is the greatest one ever. But still, what he was able to accomplish was in spite of the fact that he wasn't perfect. And it means that we, as readers of the story and people trying to take away the message, saying, well, I'm not like that. I don't have perfect speech. Neither did Moshe, because it's not the perfect speech. The ability to influence may not be in speech, it may be more in the heart. And it's true for the influence we come to bring upon other people, but it's also true for the influence that people try to bring upon us and help us in our process, our trajectory of growth. It's got to originate within our hearts, within our minds, and that's what determines the growth pattern. Staying with Perek Vav, I want to move just a little bit ahead about a fascinating pasuk. The Torah, beginning on Perek Vav pasuk 14, details a little bit about the genealogy again of the Jewish people and of some of the Shvatim, not of all of them. But we get to Shevet Levi, and as you know, Miriam and Aharon and Moshe are all part of Shevet Levi. And we get to the following. I'm going to read chapter 6, Pasuk 7, start 17. I'll read in English this time. The sons of Gershon were Livni and Shimi, according to their families. The sons of Kahat are Amram, Yitzhar, Chevron, Uziel, and Shnei Chaye, the years of Kahat's life were 133 years. So remember that Kahat had some children, and one of his sons was Amram. And who's Amram, as you know, is Moshe's father. Let's go on a little bit more. Ubnei Merari, so Levi had three sons, Kahat, Gershon, Kahat, and Merari. So Merari, the Torah tells us a little bit about Merari's family. So this is Kehat's brother's family. Machli and Mushi, those are the sons of Merari. Now, here's what the Torah says. Vayikach Amram, going back to Amram, Vayikach Amram et Yochevet Dodato lo Isha. And Amram got married. Who did he marry? He married Yochevet as a wife. And who is Yochevet? Yochevet is his aunt. And she bore him. So Amram and Yochevet get married. And she gave birth to Aaron and Moshe, of course, and to Miriam. So let's just stop a second here. Moshe married his aunt. Amram married his aunt. Does that sound funny to anybody? It should. Because not in this Chumash, but later on in the Torah tells us clearly in Sefer Vayikra, Perek Chaf, that a person's not supposed to marry their aunt. It's an Isur. It's a prohibition. In a section called Arayot, inappropriate and forbidden relationships and marriages, Torah says that a person should not marry his aunt. In fact, when talking in that whole section about forbidden marriages, the Torah not only lists the prohibition, it lists the consequence. So the consequence is the consequence which is called, excuse me, it's called karet. And that's called being cut off. It's a punishment that refers to your soul in the next world will be cut off from the fullness of the Jewish people. So it's a terrible thing to imagine. When you think about our lives, we have our physical lives, which God willing is 120. Good. Okay. Full life is 120, like Moshe. But our souls, as we've spoken before, are eternal. So when the soul resides in the physical body, it resides for 120 years or less. But the soul continues its life in the world to come, and that's eternal. And now, imagine the world to come and the promise of eternity, but having your soul cut off from all other souls. That's a punishment. It's a punishment. And that's a punishment for the whole section there of the Isurim, the prohibitions of forbidden marriages, except for one, marrying your aunt. It's not mentioned. It's a prohibition, 100%. But the punishment of karet, being excised, being cut off, it's not mentioned there. So that's an interesting observation. So Amram marries his aunt, and from his marriage to his aunt, Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam were born. Later on in the Torah, you're not allowed to marry your aunt. Marrying all these forbidden relationships results in a serious punishment, but there's no punishment mentioned specifically for marrying your aunt. So why is that? So I want to share with you a fascinating idea by Rabbi Yehuda Leib Ginsburg, another comment that I enjoy teaching, in his commentary called Yalkut Yehuda. So here's what he says, that when the Gemara talked about and the Chachamim tried to explain why there's this exception, to marrying, the punishment for marrying your aunt, it's forbidden to do. It's just the punishment is missing. Here's what Rabbi Ginsburg says is the reason, that the Chachamim are telling us that, or warning us against mentioning people's deficiencies. This is Rabbi Ginsburg's language in English. Mentioning people's deficiencies over which they have no control. So we have an obligation, and certainly at some point it might even be a mitzvah, to offer constructive criticism when it's properly expressed. However, says Rabbi Ginsburg, pointing out a stain on a person's record, which he cannot do anything about, is by definition not constructive. And so when the Chachamim spoke about the reason that there may not be any punishment connected to marrying your aunt, whereas all the other prohibited relationships have a punishment, they talk about concealing the shame of Moshe's parents' marriage to each other. Now, I want to pause for 1 second. There is no Torah at the time that Moshe's parents got married, meaning there's no prohibition, there's no chapter in Sefer Vayikra, there is no Sefer Vayikra. So what they didn't violate something that had been explicitly prohibited. However, Moshe Rabbeinu is Moshe Rabbeinu, and one would imagine that the greatest leader would come from some sort of family in which there was a wholesomeness, but that's not the case. And there may be some who think that lack of wholesomeness in Moshe's family life and genealogy somehow detracts from him, somehow has an element of shame attached to Moshe's family tree, what is in his closet, as it were, about his parents, even though legally, halachically, you could say there was no prohibition to do what they did. Yet, when we take a look at the wholeness of Torah, realize that Moshe Rabbeinu was the one who handed over the Torah to us, and he's telling us that what his own mother and father did would, in fact, retroactively or retrospectively be considered a Vaera, a sin. So that could potentially be a source of sin. So the midrash, excuse me, the midrash speaks of the need to somehow hide the shame of Moshe's parents' marriage to teach us to ignore people's flaws that can't be corrected. Noting people's imperfections is appropriate, says Rabbi Ginsburg, only if it can lead to a positive, constructive outcome. Otherwise, if it can't, then it's not justified. And so, by noting the concern to protect Moshe's honor in this regard, the Chachamim remind us to reserve criticism for situations where it's likely to be beneficial, okay? But to avoid criticism that serves no practical purpose. Now, that would again, we're adding two pieces here. We're adding the story that he married his aunt in Sefer Shemot Parsha Vaera, jumping to take a look at what it said in Sefer Vayikra, connecting them together in order to extract this message. But sometimes we love to criticize. Well, you all know that. But this message is there's no point in the criticism. And that's why the Torah didn't include the punishment for marrying an aunt, because it did not want to add more shame to the family tree of Moshe Rabbeinu. And I find it so interesting that the greatest heroes of the Jewish people, I said a minute ago, aren't always the most perfect character. I'm not saying it the right way. That in the sort of narrative of people's lives, of people who become the heroes of the Jewish people, there often are parts that could be seen in a more darker light, a negative light. So, for example, the story, do you remember Lot, who was living in Sodom, and God sent the angels following? They had helped out with Abram. They go to Sodom. They save Lot. They save his wife. They save his two daughters. And what happens after that? The two daughters think that the entire world has been decimated. They see no future because they don't see any other males. And so they get their father Lot drunk, and they sleep with him on two separate nights. Each one becomes pregnant, and thereby giving birth to two children, and one is called Moab and the other is called Ammon. So it's not such a pleasant story to think about what the father did to his two daughters. Yes, he was drunk. So you could say that he was really not responsible for his actions. And they, in fact, tried to get him drunk. They did that on purpose. So it's not as though he behaved in any licentious way. Now, why am I telling you the story? I'm telling you the story is because along the line of Jewish history, Moab becomes the nation, and we find a story later on called the story of Ruth. And Ruth comes from the people of Moab. And then the story of Ruth, as you know, at the end of Megillat Ruth, is that she gets married. They have she doesn't get married. Yeah, no, Ruth gets married, correct? And who comes from her lineage? David HaMelech. And who comes from David HaMelech's lineage? The Mashiach. So we're tracing back the Mashiach all the way back, all the way back, all the way back to where? To the story of Sodom and a father who gets inebriated and sleeps with his daughter. What? And so that becomes part of the redemption story of not only us, but clearly the world, through something that is really more dark. And that's a fascinating part of, I think, the Jewish perspective on the arc of human history, is that the heroes that we have, and I'm saying something that would be objected to by other parts of Orthodox Parsha, but I am of the opinion that the Torah wants us to see these sorts of things and understand them, and yet realize that greatness can still be associated with people who come with a whole narrative that has darker parts to it. Okay, I want to continue. I want to share with you a fascinating piece of Torah that I learned. And in order to do that, I just need to remind you a little bit about the Haggadah. I told you we're in sort of the Pesach environment here. But this is a really interesting perspective. It's by Rabbi Lewin, who wrote the book, the commentary of Drash V'Ha'im. And he too is a really the Ratio Rav, very creative thinker, very creative. And he points out, of course, as we now know, that Parsha Vaera begins the story of the 10 plagues, the Esher Makot. Now, think back for 1 second to the Pesach Seder. There's a part in the Pesach Seder getting towards the end of Magid before we get to the meal. And it's a part that has always been puzzling to me and maybe to you as well, where the Torah tells us 3 opinions, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Akiva. And each one of these 3 rabbis makes the following statement. I'll read the first one, Rabbi Yossi Haklibi. From what passage can it be inferred that the Egyptians who were smitten with 10 plagues in Egypt were afterwards smitten with 50 at the sea? Do you remember that part? You remember that part of the Haggadah? So in Egypt, they had 10 plagues, but at the Yam Suf, they had more. So the 2 opinions that I just wanted us to think about for 1 second are Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, Rabbi Akiva's opinion, as are quoted in the Midrash. But again, in the Haggadah is quoting Midrash. Just to be clear, we're now, this is a comment on the Makot in general, and the Haggadah wants us to understand that the Makot in Egypt accounted for 10 Makot, but things happen at Yam Suf. There was more there. So where do we get more? When we read the Psukim in Sefer Shemot and Parashat Bishalach, when it talks about the crossing of the Yam Suf, where does it come? So there's a verse that is quoted from the book of Tehillim, and it's this verse which serves, as it were, the source for the machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva about how many plagues, as it were, did the Egyptians suffer at the water. So here's what Rabbi Eliezer said. From what passage can it be inferred that every single plague which the Holy One, blessed be He, inflicted on the Egyptians in Egypt was in reality 4 plagues? So Rabbi Eliezer is saying, no, it's not that what happened at Yam Suf, it's that in Egypt, every one of the 10 plagues that we read about, that's the explicit plague. But in the way in which that plague was experienced, there's a subtext that it had other things to it that caused even greater suffering. And here's the verse from Tehillim. He cast, I'll read in Hebrew first. Yishalach bam charon apo, evra vaza'am v'tzara mishlachat malachei ra'im. In English, he cast upon them his fierce anger, wrath, and indignation, and trouble, and embassy of evil messengers. So we're talking about a verse in Tehillim that David HaMelech wrote. And in a classic rabbinic style, what David HaMelech wrote, which was divinely inspired, tells us a little bit about the oral Torah that associated itself with the stories of the Torah, the Chumash. And as David HaMelech wrote this verse, says Rabbi Eliezer and later Rabbi Akiva, what David HaMelech was writing in this verse was in some ways a commentary to the punishments that the Egyptians, or the suffering that Egyptians experienced with each of the Makot. So one more time, Rabbi Eliezer says that this verse, we know from which verse, he cast upon them his fierce anger, wrath, indignation, trouble, and embassy of evil messengers. So Rabbi Eliezer, my friends, when he read this verse, he did the following. He cast upon them his fierce anger. Yishalach bam charanapo. He says that's not one of the examples of God's plagues that he visited upon the Egyptians with the Esher Makot. No, it was just a description. He was angry, and as a result of his anger, he sent 4 additional plagues with each of the 10 Makot. What are those 4 additional plagues? Evra, Za'am, Sarah, Mishlachat, Malachei Ra'im. Wrath, indignation, trouble, and embassy of evil messenger. Okay, that's Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Akiva disagrees with Rabbi Eliezer and he says, no, I don't think that Rabbi Eliezer is reading this verse properly. Rabbi Akiva says there's five. There's five additional plagues that accompanied each of the 10 plagues. Five, not four. Why? Because according to Rabbi Akiva, he reads the verse, same words, but he disagrees with Rabbi Eliezer's assessment of the opening words. In Hebrew, the opening words are Yishalach ba mecharon apo. He cast upon them his fierce anger. Rabbi Eliezer says that's an introduction. He cast upon them his fierce anger. And what did that look like? It looked like these four things. That's Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Akiva says it's not an introduction, it's not an opening. It's part of what God did. He cast upon them his fierce anger. That's number one. Wrath is number two. Indignation is number three. Trouble is number four. An embassy of evil messengers is five. So when we come to understand what happened in Egypt, there's what the Torah Shebichtav says, that's the Psukim, which is 10 Makot. But understanding that David HaMelech is writing, as it were, a bit of a commentary to the Torah, David HaMelech is telling us that each of the 10 plagues had with it these sort of subcategories of suffering or intensity that we need to be mindful of. Rabbi Eliezer says there's four of them. I know I'm repeating myself, but I want to be clear. Rabbi Akiva says five. So what's this argument about? What are arguing about? So I'm going to try to get to the kernel of what the Hadrash Vayun Rabbi Aryeh Levin says, because I think it's a really fascinating observation. He says, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva were debating something that happened in our week's Parsha. So in our Parsha, in chapter 7, verse 15, chapter 7, verse 15, Hashem sends Moshe and he says the following, Lech el paro baboker, hine yotzei hamayma, v'nitzavta likrato al sfata yeor. Go to Paro in the morning. Behold, he goes out to the water, and you shall stand opposite him at the river's bank. And the staff that was turned into a snake you shall take in your hand. So according to Rabbi Lewin, this verse is important to understand what was that encounter like? What was that? Moshe is now encountering Paro at the water. So what was happening there? And so according to Rabbi Levin, there's a fascinating debate that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer are having, not just about the verse in the Haggadah, but about this encounter at the water's edge. What's the debate about? The debate about is Paro's reaction to the presence of Moshe and Aaron at the water's edge. And their response to that, their answer to that, is a very fascinating distinction between world approaches of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. So I know I'm taking a much more complicated and complex and much more developed idea, and I'm trying to bring it down to a few minutes worth of insight. Rabbi Eliezer was of the opinion that in that moment where Moshe encounters Paro, there's a level of honor that Moshe gives to Paro. He's in the presence of a king. And in the presence of a king, even a king like Paro, there's a level of deference that Paro brought to that. Now, Rabbi Akiva disagrees entirely. He says, no way. I will not accept that there's deference that Moshe Rabbeinu gave to Paro. Not happening. And there are sort of textual debates in the Gemara that Rabbi Levin produces, but I'm going to skip over that because I think the most fascinating part about that is why would they disagree about this? What is it that made Rabbi Eliezer see what he saw in the verse, and what made Rabbi Akiva say what he did when he saw this verse? And the Hadrash V'Ha'iyun suggests something about the two people's personalities and their life history that led them to that. Fascinating idea. Rabbi Eliezer was a Talmid, a student who was the spiritual inheritor of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Do you remember Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? Do you remember what he was famous for? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the person who, when he saw that the enemy, the Romans, had created a siege around Jerusalem, he came to the conclusion that fighting a fight was useless. And so he created the ruse, as you may remember, to have himself feign death, be put into a casket, and to have an entourage take him outside of the walls of Jerusalem so he could be buried, because there was no burial plots within the walls of Jerusalem. And as the Gemara tells us in Masechet Gittin, that after he was taken outside of the walled city, he escapes from the coffin and he makes his way to, Vespasian, the Roman general, to plead for what? That he not destroy Yavne. He says, listen, Tainli Yavne v'chachameha. I understand that there's no chance in saving Yerushalayim, so I'm asking you, conquer it, do what you have to do, but allow us to rebuild Tainli Yavne, the city of Yavne, and recreate our Sanhedrin in Yavne. Do you remember that story? So according to Rabbi Eliezer, that was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai showing deference to the king and asking, pleading that the conquering army allow the Jewish people and the Sanhedrin to rebuild following the fall of Jerusalem at the hands of the Romans. That's Rabbi Eliezer, who was following in the tradition or the key point in Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's life. But what was Rabbi Akiva's experience? Do you remember that? Rabbi Akiva did not have Rabbi Eliezer's attitude. Rabbi Akiva is very different. There's so many stories in the Gemara that what did Rabbi Akiva do? Rabbi Akiva felt very strongly that a man by the name of Bar Kochba, who was he? That he was going to be the new Mashiach. And Rabbi Akiva, according to the Gemara, actually walked around behind Bar Kochba carrying a bag that contained Bar Kochba's military equipment. Rabbi Akiva, according to some, was of the opinion that the Jewish nation needed to fight back against the Romans. And he, according to some, tried to foment a rebellion. Now, I know we're not talking about the Haggadah, but some opinions, I think Rabbi Riskin mentions this in his Haggadah. I think Rabbi Lau, Yisrael Meir Levi Lau, former chief rabbi of Israel, in his Haggadah, mentions this idea that I'm about to share with you that you may have heard before, which was what? Remember that part of the Haggadah which talks about the 5 rabbis in Bnei Brak, and they stayed up all night? Remember that part of the story? Well, what was that all about? What were they there for, and what were they talking about? So according to the story, they were talking about Yetziat Mitzrayim. But both Rabbi Lau and Rabbi Riskin suggest, you know what they were doing? They were talking about Rabbi, and by the way, it was Rabbi Akiva who was the Rav of Bnei Brak. They all came to Rabbi Akiva. Why? Because Rabbi Akiva was trying to enlist them in his plans to begin a rebellion against Rome. So now I have Rabbi Eliezer, who felt that acquiescing to the power of the king made sense. But Rabbi Akiva felt there's no way. He and his kishkis, in his deepest part of who he was, believed that was wrong. And he was one of the forces that really wanted to push for a rebellion. Now we go back to this verse, says Rabbi Levin in his Drush Kabbalah, and I understand what's going on here. When it comes to how each one saw that encounter between Moshe Rabbeinu and Paro at the water, informs how they read that verse. Rabbi Akiva felt what they did was, we will not comply with the king. Let the king taste the full measure of God's wrath. 5 words, 5 languages of punishment, 5, not 4. Each one of the 10 plagues was accompanied by 5 levels of intensity, says Rabbi Akiva. Absolutely. Rabbi Eliezer, on the other hand, because he saw perhaps that there was an expression of deference at the moment that Moshe Rabbeinu encountered the king, said no, 4, because there is a moment of deference. And Rabbi Akiva said, no way. What I find so interesting about this piece of Torah is that what Rabbi Lewin is asking us and encouraging us to do is to see the study of Torah not as simply textual analysis, but to understand the fullness of who we are that we bring to the study of Torah. Rabbi Akiva was an extraordinary person. He's almost like, I'm not going to say he's mythic, but he's one of the heroes of the Jewish people. He's clearly a hero of the Jewish people. It's Rabbi Akiva, in fact, was through his following the Korban Beit HaMikdash after Tisha B'Av, he rebuilt all of Judaism in the south with his 5 students from whom all of Torah came. Rabbi Eliezer is no slouch, but what Rabbi Lewin is trying to suggest, that each one brought their own life experience to understand the encounters that we're reading in the Torah, and that it's okay to do that. Obviously, we have to be guided by and shaped and influenced by the world of Torah. We can't come up with ideas that are so alien to what the Torah is saying, to what our tradition is saying. We can't come up with a tradition which directly counters everything that all the premises that we have. However, suggesting that Rabbi Akiva's personal story, his Weltanschauung, informed how he understood this verse is totally, in fact, an acceptable method, as is with Rabbi Eliezer, who saw something different than Rabbi Akiva did, a moment of deference, a moment of sort of not conflict, but a moment in which even Moshe Rabbeinu shared a moment of deference with a king who was seen as a villainous king. But the idea that we bring who we are to this encounter, I find such an exciting idea, because as you heard me say throughout the time that we studied Torah together, I think that's the level in which, in some ways, we have to study. We encounter Torah with the personalities that God gave us and the thoughts that we have to make it come alive for us in a manner that animates us and makes it our Torah. That's why it's called Torat Chaim, a living Torah. We bring its life to ourselves. All right, thank you everybody for listening. Please feel free to unmute yourselves. Happy to hear some of your ideas and thought, either
Thank,
for or against.
thank, thank you, Rabbi. That was great. And you've inspired me to come back next week.
Oh my goodness, I'm thrilled.
There I go. I used it correctly. Take care.
Good.
Thank
you. I like that.
Thank you.
Where's this?
Rabbi,
I'm here.
Going back to Amram and Yocheved.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at the Hertz, which has that funny translation, which says he took his father's sister to wife. The Hebrew says Dodato.
Right. It doesn't say the relationship specifically. Correct.
Right. So does any of the commentators?
Yeah. The translation in the Hertz is based on the Gemara, which says that was exactly the case.
Ah, okay. So I was thinking maybe some of the commentators took the opposite view, which is that Dorato is a generic term, not necessarily meaning literally, it could be a cousin.
No, in this case, it means aunt, as it commonly is used.
Literally, okay.
Yeah, literally, exactly, as is commonly used. Okay, one at a time. I can't hear when everybody screams like you guys are doing, so please take your turn one at a time. Raise your hand or something. Wow.
Rabbi,
Yes.
Yocheved was one of the 70 that came down to Egypt, correct?
Born at the very end, yeah. According to some Midrashim, correct.
Okay. Just a comment.
Okay. And by the way, when everybody talks about the slavery in Egypt, how long do you think it lasted for?
230 years.
And of the 230 years, how long was the hard labor last? You know? 80. So they weren't backbreaking years for all of the time. And where we start counting that's another big machloket amongst the Meforshim. Where do you start counting? When Avraham had his vision of the Brit Bein Bitarim in the 15th chapter Bereshit, Hashem says 400 years. Wait, so 400 years. Where do you start counting? So you may be counting before they go down to Egypt, but from what we can gather, that really back-breaking work that we associate with Egypt, that was about an 80-year period.
83.
But that's sort of like a generation, isn't it? I mean, I think that would be a generation. Yeah. And then, you could be born into a generation where your parents were slaves, siblings were slaves, maybe even grandparents. Yep, could be. Okay, so I hope to see everybody here at Hashem next Tuesday night, 8 p.m. May this coming week be a week of bracha for all of us. Good news. It's still somewhat distressing on a weekly basis to listen to all the anti-Semitic things that are going on around the world. But, as Chazal say about the experience in Mitzrayim, it was a Kur Barzel. It was considered to be a place that refined the Jewish people through heat, through intense heat. It was not easy. It was not easy, but we came out of it with a mission. And we are uniquely positioned to fulfill that mission. We are the descendants of the nation that lived through unspeakable horrors, ancient, not so ancient, and we have the ability to do amazing things. So let's do amazing things. Have a good week, everybody. All the best. Take care. Thank you for joining.
Thanks very much, Rabbi Diamond.
Thank you, Rabbi Diamond.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good
Bye.
day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.